All right, so in Unit 5, we are going to focus on the use of frames in a web page, and many of you have actually seen frames before. You'll observe that very, very quickly as we get started, and by the end of this chapter, you'll have a strong understanding of how frames work and how to incorporate them into your own websites. So Lesson 1 is going to focus pretty heavily on the vocabulary related to frames, what frames look like, and then some of the tags and attributes that we'll be using as we begin coding our own frames. So our learning targets for this particular lesson, 1 is you'll be able to describe the elements of a web page frame. You'll be able to describe the parts of a frame definition file, and you'll be able to create frames for displaying different web pages using the FRAMESET and frame tags. So that's what you should be able to do by the end of this lesson. So to begin this lesson, I want you to start by doing a frames exploration. This is very similar to the image map exploration that you did last unit. So I want you to go grab that handout out of the bin and then answer the questions on the screen and the ones that are on your handout related to frames. So once you're done with that, you can move on, but do that exploration first. So now that you've got a feel for what a frame is, we're actually going to dive in and start looking at that vocabulary related to frames. So when many of you hear the word frames, you instantly start to think of picture frames, which are generally rectangular. And frames are kind of similar to that. They are essentially rectangular areas of web pages acting as windows for various pages. So that's when your web page is broken up into different rectangular shaped boxes. And for example, this would be 3 different frames on a screen. Or maybe you have something that looks like this. You have 2 different frames on a screen. So a frame is a rectangular area, and what frames allow us to do is they allow us to display several web pages on the screen at once. So instead of having just one web page on the screen, our browser can actually display 1, 2, 3, however many frames we have worth of different web pages on the screen at one time. Because essentially what happens is that each frame displays a different individual web page, which is then capable of interacting with the other pages. So we display multiple pages, and then we can actually ask them to interact with each other. So that's kind of the basics of what a frame in web programming actually is. Now, frames are pretty great because when they are properly used, and the big thing there is properly, when they are properly used, they can give your web page a very clean, uncluttered look, and it can make the navigation between web pages very, very easy. So by including frames, you can add those components into your web page. Now, they can also be used in place of other things we've already talked about. So we've used tables for organization. We can actually use frames in place of tables or even in place of menu bars to help us organize information or provide navigational options to our screen. So frames are just another option that you can use for organization and navigation. Now, a frame set, and notice that this is not a frame, but a frame set, is the most common way of using frames. So notice the different word here, frame sets versus frames. So a frame set describes how to divide a web page into 2 or more frames. So a frame set is how we're dividing that web page up. So you have a frame, which is the actual rectangular area, and you have a frame set, which is how you are describing your way of breaking your web page up into frames. Common applications of frame sets include creating a menu frame, a header frame, a content frame, and etc. So what I'd like you to do at this point in your notes, because frames and frame set are pretty easily confused for students, is I want you to compare and contrast between frames and frame set. What is a frame? What is a frame set? And how are they related to each other? So pause the video and fill in that piece of your notes. So while frames do make it easy to organize information on a web page and they make navigation easier as well, they do have their disadvantages. And one is that you have longer loading times due to the fact that you have to load in multiple web pages at once. So you're not just loading one web page, you're loading multiples, and as a result, those multiple web pages make the loading time a little bit slower. In addition, some search engines have problems actually adding in web pages with frames to their databases. So it may actually be harder to discover when you're searching for web pages online. So just kind of keep that in check. The use of frames does make it a little more complicated for those search engines to identify that your web page fits the search of the user of that particular search engine. So throughout this chapter, we are essentially going to make a website for an artist and allow somebody to navigate their website and view different images by clicking in a menu bar, and also view an order form if they wish to order particular prints. So that is the type of website that we will be creating this chapter as a class. So as we create our web page, this will be what the main page looks like. So when we open up the main page of our web page, you'll see off to the side that we have a little logo up here in the corner. We also have this menu bar chunk right in here, and then we have a main page that displays a variety of pictures. So that will be kind of the main base, the main skeleton of our website. Now, in case you didn't notice from the previous slide, the way that my information is laid out is actually laid out in frames. And we're going to talk through how we break apart our web page into these frames. But if you look very, very carefully, you can see that you have the first frame up here in the corner where the logo is found. So you have that Bill Thomas Illustrations logo up there as one frame. You then have a second frame right here with that menu bar where you can click on the different images. And then you have this main frame right here that displays the image that you'd like to display. So you notice that you have 1, 2, 3 frames that you will actually be designing and creating with different web pages for your website. Now, something that we'll be programming our web page to do is we'll be programming it to change the picture in this main frame as something in our menu bar is clicked. So if we clicked this picture, so I put a C there for click, when we click it, instead of taking us to a new web page for that link instead displays the bigger version of this picture in the main page. So we're actually going to change that main frame picture as we start programming this website. And then you can see as we click on the next picture, so we click on the full color picture, again, it's going to change the main frame to display the corresponding picture. And then a third time, that same process, as we click on the ink wash picture here, the ink wash picture will appear in the main frame. And then finally, as we click on the order form, it will actually display the web page for the order form that you could print off and then order the picture with. So you can see that the different areas where we click display something different in this main frame right here. So now that we have kind of a vision of where our project is going to take us, we're actually going to talk about using frames within websites and then some more of the key vocabulary as well as the tags we'll be using and some of the attributes that we will be using. So to start, just a few additional notes about frames. First, they are really useful when creating a navigation menu. I know that we've created, horizontal menu bars and vertical menu bars before, but frames are particularly useful because we can display the same menu bar on the screen in a specific frame for the entire time that website is up. We don't have to recode that menu bar into each individual page. Instead, we can just have that one single menu bar web page appear in one frame. The other thing that's really nice is that you can keep headers, navigation menus, and other information all on the screen as other parts of the web page change. So what you'll notice as we create this Bill Thomas Illustrations one are that frame number 1 and frame number 2 down here, those two frames always remain the same, while frame number 3 is the frame that is actually changing. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we can keep the same information right here on the screen and then just change what's happening in one frame. It's kind of cool to have that consistency there. Now, if we decide we want to use frames in our website, what we have to do is we have to create a frame definition file. So we create this file, and this file is really what displays in the browser. So something to note is this file is very important. If you want to create frames, you need to create a frame definition file. It is the first step in creating frames and using them within a website. Then from there, as you get started, I would really sit down and define the layout of your frame. Sit down, draw it out. Do you want 2 frames? Do you want 3 frames? Do you want 4 frames? Because that can really change how your frame definition file is going to be coded. And then I want you to specify the web page contents of each frame. So for example, maybe this first one is your header. This one down here is your menu bar. Kind of think about what the purpose of each frame is going to be, what will be displayed, and if it will or will not change. Now, as I stated on the previous slide, this frame definition file is what opens in the window. It will be the URL or the website that's in the address box. So this is what is in the browser. This is what is being displayed. Now, what a frame definition file does is it defines the web pages that appear in each frame when the page is first loaded and when a user clicks a link. So this frame definition file is going to break up the web page browser, and then from there it's going to say in each frame what web page should be displayed when the page is first loaded, and then what happens when a user clicks on a link, and if any of those different frames will change what is being displayed. Now, in order to even start building a frame definition file, we have to use what are called FRAMESET tags. So the FRAMESET tags are used to define the layout of the frames that are being displayed. So these 2 tags right here help us to define the structure of those frames, and if we're breaking the browser up into columns or into rows, and at what size those frames should be. So start making a note to yourself that the FRAMESET tags are how we break up that window into various frames. Now, kind of tied together with the FRAMESET tags are the frame tags. So notice that we have our FRAMESET tags to kind of break apart our window, and a frame tag from there is required for each frame. So the frame tag really defines the content of a frame and how it will appear. So the FRAMESET tag is how we break everything up, how we break that window up into different frames. And then the frame tag, which notice has no ending tag, the frame tag really defines the content for each frame and how that frame will be displayed on the screen. Now, a third tag to be aware of is the no frames tag. And notice how we have an opening and closing tag down here. And no frames tags are kind of like when you have text links paired with an image map. They are used to define alternate content if for some reason that browser does not support frames. So that's kind of like your emergency section. Like if for some reason the frames don't work, this is what I want displayed on my web page. And these are actually supported by multiple browsers and really should be used in case so that people can still navigate your website if needed. So this is just a really quick recap of those tags. We have the FRAMESET tag, the frame tag, and the no frames tag, and those will be what we primarily use throughout this particular unit. Now what I have displayed on the screen are the FRAMESET and frame tag attributes. All you should maybe do right now is maybe write down this column right here. Just write down the different attributes. We will talk about this part, the functions of these, in lesson 2. That's kind of the focus of the next lesson, being able to discuss the different attributes and their purpose and how they'll work together to create and design frames on a web page. So on the next couple of slides, we're just going to talk about these new tags in general and talk about how we can use them to break apart a window in a browser into multiple frames. So here you see we have 1, 2, 3 different frames being displayed, and we'll talk about how FRAMESET tags and frame tags work together to really break these apart. So similar to tables and similar to image maps, you really need to start planning before you dive in and try to code frames in a frame definition file. So something to note is how this is really broken apart. So what I like to do, and I'm going to zoom this out a little bit, is I like to actually draw my page one frame set break at a time. So here I'm going to draw my entire window. That's what I start with. I start with my entire window, and that's the note that I have right here. Then from here, I think about that Bill Thomas Illustrations website, and I know that what really happens is it looks like this picture up here in red. So I'm going to kind of keep that picture there and think through how I maybe created that particular picture. So I see, and what I notice is that the first thing I did was I took this big entire page and I broke it into two columns. So I first broke it into two columns. And this first column takes up about 25% of the browser, and the second column takes up about 75% of the browser. So that's the first thing I did. I broke it into two columns. Then from there, what I did next was I broke that first column into two rows. And this took up about 20% and 80%. So I first broke it into columns, and then I broke the first column up into two rows. Now, something to note as we get to the next page is every time we break apart a frame into more frames, we're going to use the frame set tag. So because we have two breaks here, what that tells us is we will have two frame set tags, because each time we break it, we have to use a frame set tag to do so. And then because I have 3 frames, I will have 3 frame tags. Okay, so here's where in your notes you should be writing some code down. Now, something to note is we're not going to write the full code because we haven't talked about the attributes yet, but we're just going to talk about those frame set tags and those frames. So something to remember from the previous page is that we started with the entire page. We then broke it into 2 columns, so we're going to need a frame set tag for that. And then we broke column 1 into 2 rows. So for right now, I want you to pretend that we have all of the skeleton code in there. We have the HTML, we have the header, we have all of that in. And I just want you to think about how we're breaking apart this page. So something to note is that we break it into 2 columns. So every time we break it, we need to have a frame set tag. So we're going to start with that. We're going to start, and I'm going to do this in green to match my notes. I'm going to start with a frame set tag. And then from there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, you use a columns attribute and a rows attribute to really break this apart. So we're taking this frame set and we are breaking it up into 2 columns. So we say we're breaking this frame set up into 2 columns, and I want them to take up 25% of my browser window and 75%. Okay? And then I can close that off down below. And there we go. So I know between those 2 frame set tags, I've now broken it up into 2 columns. Now from here, I start coding each column. So here's column number 1, here's column number 2. Now when I look at column number 1, what I notice is I break that one up into 2 rows. So I'm going to go in, I have another frame set tag because I'm breaking this up, and I'm going to break it up into 2 rows. And then from there, I can close it off. Now from here, this is where we're not going to have super intense detailed coding because we don't know all the attributes for the frame tag in there yet. But then what we do is we say, well, we know that this part accommodates for column 1. And I know that that has 2 frames in it. So I would have, frame tag 1, and then I'd put all its attributes in there and define it. And frame tag 2 for the second row, put all the attributes in there and define it. And then after column 1 is complete, I can include the 3rd frame for column 2. And again, put all the attributes in there. And note that that belongs to column 2. So that's just kind of frame sets on a general level. Being able to think through how you might break it apart. And then tomorrow what we'll do in the next lesson is we'll talk about the different attributes that we can use to really define each individual frame. So just to recap what we saw, frame set tags break up the frame into more frames, so columns and rows. There will be a frame tag for each frame, and again, these will take a lot of planning, just like tables, just like image maps. You're going to want to think through it before you begin coding that particular frame definition file. Now, I know I showed you the rows attribute and the columns attribute on the previous few slides, but just to kind of reiterate, when we have rows inside of that frame set tag, that's going to break up our frame or that column or whatever we're trying to break up into 2 rows. So you'll see that on the next slide. So you can see here that this is broken up into 2 rows. We have 30% up here and 70% down here. Then if you look at this page, you should already be predicting that this columns here is going to split up that window into 2 columns. And then here we can confirm that. Here we have 30% and 70% of the width of that window. And that matches the column expectations that we had on the previous slide. Now, just as a final note, more than 2 frames with rows and columns like we saw with the Bill Thomas illustrations, so here like this, those can be created by nesting the frame set tags inside of each other. So that's where we have a frame set tag within a frame set tag to break that row or that column up even further. So if you want to break it up into more than 2, you're going to have to plan by nesting or putting those frame set tags inside of each other. So what I mean by that is when you have, see, here's a frame set tag and then I close it off. If I'm nesting, what I mean is that indented inside I have a full other frame set of tags. So those are nested and those will kind of break up another chunk and create more than 2 frames within a window. So you're now done with lesson 1, so you can now go grab worksheet 5A, and that'll walk you through some of the key vocabulary terms related to frames.